Shedeur Sanders suffered an oblique injury in Browns practice on Wednesday that will most likely sideline him from the Browns' second preseason game Saturday against the Eagles. This means it's Dillon Gabriel's time to shine this Saturday. And I have a very, very special guest joining the show, NFL columnist with USA Today, Jarrett Bell, joins the show to give an update on the Browns quarterback competition, to preview Dillon Gabriel's first start, and also discuss other topics around the NFL, including the Dallas Cowboys, give an update on Tampa Bay Buccaneers training camp, and so much more here on Bailey Price Media Live. All this and more here on the other side. What's going on, everybody? Happy Thursday. Welcome back to another edition of Bailey Price Media Live. If you're just tuning in, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe, become a member. We already got a new member. Shout out to my main man, loyal member of the Bailey Price Media Army, Eric, joining the Bailey Price Media Army, becoming a member. Shout out to him. I can't thank you guys enough for tuning in. We got a very, very special show for you. Lots to discuss here on this fine Thursday. If you're just coming over from 0 to 60 with Matt McChesney and I, we had a great show over there talking all things Colorado Buffaloes football news. And so now we begin here talking with Cleveland Browns quarterback situation. Shedeur Sanders has an oblique injury. Unfortunately, he'll be sidelined most likely from the Browns' second preseason game this Saturday. But we're going to discuss that and so much more here on Bailey Price Media Live. And without further ado, I got a very, very special guest joining the show. This man has been covering pro football for USA Today since 1993. It's an absolute honor to have somebody with this perspective who's been covering the game as long as him. He's also part of the selection committee for the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and I can't thank him enough for joining. My main man, Jarrett Bell, joins the show. Jarrett, what up, man? Happy Thursday. Thank you for joining, man.
Hey, Bailey. I appreciate the invite, man, and I love that opening. That's hot. That will get you jazzed up to watch this podcast and to subscribe and all that, and it's a good way to kind of set the tone. But how long have you been doing this, my man?
I've been in this a couple years now. I stopped playing college football and I decided to jump right into it. I work for a guy named Coach JB. He was on Last Chance U on Netflix. So I produced his podcast and then, kind of started working my up, branched off of my own, started covering the Colorado Buffaloes with Matt McChesney, who's a alumnus of that school, played in the NFL, and, started my own channel here about a year ago. So we're about a year strong here on BPM Live here and just working my way up, my man. But Jared, I can't thank you enough for joining, my man. It's an absolute honor, and I would love to talk. The thumbnail says it here. The Cleveland Browns quarterback situation is quite a show, but it's the Dillon Gabriel show on Saturday. Shedeur Sanders has an oblique injury, and he will not most likely not be playing in the Browns' second preseason game. Let me ask you, what are your perspective on the Browns quarterback situation? I think you were there covering Browns-Panthers joint training camp, and that was quite an ordeal. Shedeur had a hell of a start, I think, in his first start. But what are your thoughts on the Browns quarterback situation headed into their second preseason game?
Yeah, I think, Bailey, it's still TBD, right?
Yep.
So, they've got Joe Flacco, the veteran guy. You're always going to wonder, hey, how long can Joe Flacco go? Just from the standpoint that he's like 40 years old. That's about it. But right. I think that's a solid option, but not the long-term option, obviously. Sure. And so you really wanted to see one of these younger guys kind of take charge, and that's Dillon Gabriel, as you mentioned, and Shedeur. And it's just kind of ironic that last week, Shedeur Sanders, and I was at that preseason game in Carolina, he really made the most out of his opportunity. And part of the opportunity being that he played almost 3 full quarters. It's 45 plays that he played. I mean, that was an extended look. And for a guy who had not received any reps with the first team during training camp, and maybe none with the second team. I mean, he really kind of showed that once he gets out there and he can ball a little bit, that some of his, natural talents and not natural in the sense that he's not a skilled technician at quarterback, but just some of his skill was able to, get him through that night. And then he gets hurt. And now Dillon Gabriel will have the same opportunity because Dillon Gabriel didn't play because he's had a hamstring injury. And so this will give the Browns an opportunity to evaluate Dillon maybe as well as they were able to evaluate Shedeur. And I say evaluate because the one thing that happened last week with all that time that Shedeur had, on the field was the fact that they had so many different types of situations, right?
True, very true.
I mean, he even had a play where he did a quarterback sneak on 4th and short. He was backed up near his own goal line one time. He got possession one time after a turnover with a short field, 2 red zone opportunities, a lot of 3rd and longs. And so you got to see him execute in a lot of different situations. So maybe Dillon Gabriel will get that. But to answer your question, I know it's a long-winded answer for you, but in terms of, what the Browns will do at quarterback, I think it's twofold. I think, A, you get ready for week 1, and that's pretty much going to be Joe Flacco. Yeah. And then after that, you figure, who's your developmental guy? Who do we feel more confident in moving forward? And, Dillon Gabriel was drafted in the 3rd round and Shedeur in the 5th round. So a lot of people read that to say, okay, Dillon Gabriel has a leg up because of that. And that's a fair assumption, but I don't think that's the end all at all. And saw what Shedeur could do on the field. Let's see what Dillon Gabriel can do when he gets an opportunity to play. Even though it's preseason, it's vanilla and all that, it's the opportunity to be able to put your best foot forward when you have the opportunity to play.
Absolutely. And I think Saturday is a massive, massive teller for the Browns quarterback situation going forward. It's a massive test for Dillon Gabriel because I think, Jarrett, I don't know if you can see how passionate the Sanders and the Colorado fans coming over to Cleveland are. They're very passionate. And I think a lot of people are rooting against Dillon Gabriel. And that's no knock on the kid. That's just the Sanders media power. That's the power of it. Now, I think Dillon Gabriel has the potential to really put a leg in his quarterback competition. If he goes out and plays well, that is going to really light some things up in the quarterback competition. But if he goes out there and struggles, and I don't know how you felt about this, but I think they may roll him out there with some starters. I don't expect all starters, but I think they'll have more, he has been taking reps with the 1s and 2s a lot more than Shedeur. We saw Shedeur go out there with 3s and 4s playing well. If I expect him to roll out with more starters, so it's going to be telling for Gabriel's performance on Saturday. Going back to what you said about Shedeur and the Panthers game, one of my favorite things, you mentioned this, so many different looks for Shedeur. Him coming out of under center, something we didn't see at Colorado at all. There's so many different things. Him adjusting and reading blitzes in the pocket. I mentioned that early in the game, he seemed kind of flustered, at least in the early parts. We saw him kind of drift into his old habits of drifting back and rolling back in the pocket. That second touchdown pass where you had a linebacker blitz through the B gap, running back kind of took a second to recognize it. But once Shedeur stepped to the side and trusted that the running back was going to make that block, and he gets that ball in there. That was one of my favorite parts of Shedeur's preseason performance. Going back to what you mentioned, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I love the way you just broke all that down, my man. And obviously, you've seen Shedeur throughout his whole tenure at Colorado, and probably before that as well. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that's so intriguing about Shedeur is that so many of us have watched this kid, right?
Oh, yeah.
In terms of all the exposure he got in college at Colorado. And, that Dillon Gabriel, frankly, didn't get. And so when I watch Dillon Gabriel this weekend, it'll be the first time I've ever seen him play. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, I know other people have seen him play, obviously, but I watched a whole lot of Shedeur throughout his time in college just because. And so was much more familiar. And so just to your point about some of the habits he had at Colorado that people would flag in terms of trying to scramble to make plays. We saw some of that, but we also saw a guy adjust during the game. So, Dillon Gabriel, big mystery as far as this one goes. But Shedeur, I think we want to see when he does get back from the injury, if he's going to be able to build on what he did.
Absolutely. My final question on the Browns, we'll move on to across the NFL. And I had Mary Kay Cabot on, prominent Cleveland Browns reporter, covered them a long time. And I asked her, do you think the Browns will keep 4 quarterbacks? This is something I've debated all offseason. I had Zach Jackson, covers the Browns for The Athletic, on, asked him the same thing. And they've given me all different answers because we don't really know. It's going to be interesting. Mary Kay doesn't really expect them to roster 4. She expects that one of them is going to be traded off, presumably Kenny Pickett, and I'll get your take on that. But what do you think? Do you think the Browns will keep 4 quarterbacks come 53-man roster time?
Yeah, I like what Mary Kay said. If they can trade one, because the quarterback position is still just the most valuable position in football, and particularly in the NFL for what we're talking about. And so I think another option would be to try to get one of the younger guys to stay on the practice squad. And if you really don't want to do that, because if you were to put Dillon Gabriel or Shedeur on the practice squad, then you could lose them in week 2, because the thing about the practice squad is any other team in the league can come and get him without owing the Browns any sort of compensation. So I don't really see that as an option, but I think that's the sort of thing that you still have to consider as possibly being on the table. But to your point, I think it'll be very difficult for the Browns to keep 4 quarterbacks, particularly if one is injured and not up to snuff. And so if you can get a deal for somebody, and like you mentioned Kenny Pickett, he might be the guy who has the most trade value, if you will. So for them to move from Pickett, though, let me tell you what's going to have to happen. They're going to have to really feel good about one of these young quarterbacks, because Joe Flacco's a snap away. And let's not forget Tyler Huntley, who was signed a couple of weeks ago by the Browns when Pickett and Dillon had the hamstring injuries. He's got to be a factor too in terms of our readiness for week 1. So if you were to trade, say, a Kenny Pickett, then would you be better off with a Snoop Huntley as the number 2? Or do you feel good enough about one of these young guys to say, we'll go into the season knowing that Joe Flacco could be just a snap away from being injured, which you can say about any player on any team, obviously.
No doubt. And here's my hypothesis on this. Kenny Pickett played for Kellen Moore last season in Philly. We've seen quarterback. New Orleans got an interesting quarterback situation going on, and it only spirals after their first week of the preseason. I think with Kenny Pickett having a hamstring injury, not really taking a lot of reps in practice, not playing in now 2 preseason games, from the sense I got that was they wanted Kenny to compete for the starting spot. And I think 2 preseason games in, if he doesn't really return next week, I think he could be he may be the odd man out in the Browns quarterback room. You mentioned Snoop Huntley. Mary Kay said that he's more of a camp body, so it'd be hard for me to see that they'd prioritize him over the rookie. That said, he was just there, and so he knows Stefanski's system to an extent. So it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. To your point, I don't think if they put either of those guys, especially Shedeur, on a practice squad, they're going to be plucked pretty quickly, I think. No?
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think the thing with Snoop Huntley is the fact that he's a veteran guy who has had some snaps in the league. So sure, you may not want to have a rookie being 1 snap away, but if you've got a veteran guy who could be there for an emergency, just like they brought him in, camp body or not, whatever. All these guys that are not locks to make the team right now are camp bodies. So let's not minimize that possibility, but I understand the context. I mean, here's a guy who was brought in because of injuries after camp opened. So you wouldn't expect that he'd be that guy, but if everybody's hurt, then what do you have?
Yeah, absolutely. The Browns are. I think Shedeur is an extremely talented player. I think Gabriel is extremely talented too. It's really who is going to fit best in Stefanski's offense, and I think we're going to find that out pretty soon. We can see on Saturday. We'll see how Gabriel looks. I'm excited. I'll be watching. I think a lot of people will be watching as well. Jarrett, I can't thank you enough for joining. I want to go to Tampa Bay. So they had their first preseason game against the Tennessee Titans. Obviously, we got to see Cam Ward in Tennessee, and I'll ask you about him in a second. But one of the rookies on Tampa Bay, who I think is a hell of a player, Emeka Egbuka. He comes from the state of Washington, like myself. He went to Stellacum High School down in southern part of the state of Washington. But obviously, hell of a player from Ohio State. We got to see a little flashes of him in preseason. I thought he did a hell of a job. What are your thoughts on Egbuka's potential for the Buccaneers this season and with Baker as QB?
Yeah, it's off the charts. You look at the Bucs and kind of what their wide receiver room has been for a number of years. Go back to when Tom Brady went there, and one of the reasons he went there was like, oh my goodness, they've got all these guys at wide receiver.
Yeah.
And then they go out and they draft him this year when they still have, Mike Evans and Chris Godwin coming off an injury. It's just kind of, just adding another big time playmaker. And, Mike Evans is not going to play forever anyway. And so, that was a smart move by the Bucs, because we're talking about a league where if you have domination with your passing game, you can win a whole lot. So all that to say, Bailey, when I got to Bucs camp, people were raving about him. And, I talked to Todd Bowles, and I talked to Baker, and I talked to the GM, Jason Light, and everybody pretty much said the same thing. So maybe it's a company line. There's like, this guy does not act like a rookie. He acts like a 10-year vet, right? And so when you hear that about a rookie, that means something, because you come in and not only do you, have to perform and get used to the NFL routine, but you've got a lot to absorb in terms of the playbook and the mental side of it. So he's done that. And then, how he carries himself within the team, and for people to use that kind of description about him, that told me something. And then I watched him in practice, and I can see the trust that Baker Mayfield has in Egbuka already. And so it's going to be dynamite to watch, how he'll fit into the flow. But I think the Bucs overall are one of these teams, they kind of own the division really for a number of years. But, can they break through and go to that another level and maybe get back to a Super Bowl? Are they a sleeper Super Bowl contender? I think so.
Mm-hmm. And definitely something to watch with Egbuka, wide receiver depth in Tampa Bay. From what I've heard, Chris Godwin's not going to be back for week one, as far as I know. And that could be a lot of reps open for him. They got the kid McMillan as well, who I think is a hell of a player. A lot of dudes, and they Trey Palmer I'm missing, and then Kate Otten, obviously a tight end. They got some dudes in that offense here. So I think definitely some depth at wide receiver, along with Egbuka, who we just mentioned as well.
Yep. Yeah. And people were saying that he's like, the best receiver to come out of Ohio State. Somebody said that, and it's like, whoa. Because Ohio State has been so rich at wide receiver for so long. So that's a great compliment to him, no doubt.
Absolutely. So much time.
We just raised the expectations for him. That's all.
Yeah, he's a hell of a player. So much talent coming out of Columbus. One more Buccaneers player I want to ask you about. We've been talking a little bit of Shedeur Sanders. I want to ask you about Shedeur Sanders. He had a preseason debut in the Titans and Buccaneers preseason game, and I thought he had a pretty good preseason debut from the sounds of it with Todd Bowles. Todd Bowles seems pretty happy with him. Shiloh's working his way up, and the Buccaneers' depth here, safety-wise, kind of at the bottom of the depth chart, obviously being an undrafted guy, but he's working his way up, playing special teams, rushing players off the edge and stuff. But how's Shiloh doing so far in Bucs training camp and preseason?
I think he's doing as well, if not better than expected for a guy who was an undrafted free agent, right? So get that. You hear from Todd Bowles and Jason Light that he has a legitimate shot to make the team. And you mentioned some of the factors there. Yeah, the safety depth chart and then special teams. But the other thing about Shiloh that's so interesting is that for an undrafted, I'm trying to think how I asked the question exactly, but I think I asked Todd Bowles or something. Have you ever had an undrafted player receive as much attention as Shedeur Sanders? The answer was absolutely not. And then Jason Light was telling me a story. He said, when we signed him, you bring the player into your office, you have the contract, and you got to sign on the dotted line. Well, he comes in with a camera crew, documenting this, and that's kind of the age that we're in. But just like with Shedeur, Shiloh had, and Travis Hunter obviously as well, just had such a presence based on, their time at Colorado and just kind of how much exposure they got in those situations. But I got a chance to talk to Shiloh for a few minutes after practice, and I found him to be very engaging, and very mature as well. And so part of that obviously comes from being Deion's son, but it also speaks to his opportunity here in the NFL to kind of fit in. And it didn't seem from my short time in Bucs camps that any of the players had any issue with him and the attention he gets as an undrafted guy. But of course, the proof will be in the pudding when they make their roster cuts and see where he fits in. But special teams is obviously a place where a guy could make a difference if you're on the fence, if you're going to make the team or not. That and injuries are always factors, obviously.
No, absolutely. And with Shiloh's case, super personable. Like, I think after he's done playing, he'll be on a TV show or something one day. He is super entertaining, super personable to talk to. But also, you mentioned special teams. I think he could have a long career in the NFL if he works his way up, finds his way onto a roster, plays special teams, does a little nitty gritty. But he mentioned earlier in Bucs offseason, he was the snack guy, bringing all the snacks and stuff. Just those little, those little things go a long way when you're an undrafted guy like that. And I think in Shiloh's case, obviously his last name is going to help him a lot, but also I think Todd Bowles kind of has a history of having safeties that are kind of like him, kind of a box safety, slower hips. They used to have Jordan Whitehead. I kind of look at them very similarly. I don't know if you remember Jordan Whitehead they used to have on the roster. I look at them player-wise kind of similarly, and we got to see a chance to see Shiloh blitz off the edge a little bit in the day and age where the hard-hitting safety is kind of out the door. I think Shiloh is in a good spot with Todd Bowles and the Buccaneers. What are your thoughts there?
Oh, no doubt about it. And when you talk about Todd Bowles and his background, being a former safety, defensive back, that kind of lends a little extra. I don't know if it's an advantage or anything. Well, I don't know if it's an advantage, but it definitely adds a layer to the equation for scrutiny, right? So Todd Bowles is going to see things and recognize things in a guy like Shedeur Sanders that maybe other head coaches won't. So I think that's a plus for him as well. In terms of his name, the Sanders name, being Deion's son, it's a blessing and a curse. But I think you've got to look at it if you're him and if you're Shiloh and Shedeur as being a blessing, because people are at least going to pay attention. So what you do with that attention is kind of on you. But it definitely doesn't hurt him.
No doubt. Well said there. And best luck to Shiloh making the Bucs roster. I expect him to. I think he'll work his way up. I think he keeps doing the little nitty gritty things, and he performs right in preseason, and plays special teams, and pisses people off in practice. I think he definitely has a shot. Jarrett, I can't thank you enough. I want to go to Dallas here. I got to ask you, I'm really excited to see the Cowboys this season, but I think one of the biggest factors to their success is the running back position. Now, they have a player who is a former USFL MVP in Kevontae Turpin, and every year it seems like they come out and line him up at running back. I know Brian Schottenheimer has talked about how Kevontae Turpin looks natural running the football with the ball in his hands, but how do you feel about the Cowboys running back position? How does Kevontae Turpin fit into that? And it seems like he's going to have an increased role in the Cowboys offense in some capacity this season. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, at some capacity. I think that's the key phrase here. And you put him into a situation, and now they've got George Pickens alongside CD Lamb. And so I think that's going to help open up some things for Turpin. But let me just start. As a running back, no, I don't see it, obviously. They've got Miles Sanders, and they've got a rookie from Texas, Blue, who look good. But to the point of, could they have special packages that they use to create some opportunities for Turpin? Oh, no question. You can do that. But the way I see it, Bailey, is, he could be a guy in terms of his impact in the running game. We know he can do things as a receiver, but in terms of in the running game, he could be that guy like the Rams have used receivers, running jet sweeps and things of that nature to give you different looks. Because, and hey, it could be 3rd and 1, right? And you don't have to just run the ball up the middle on 3rd and 1. Although some people will say that's kind of the shortest distance between 2 points, but you can also stretch the field and use things creatively with those jet sweeps. And so I think Turpin will give them an option like that. And hey, you go back to last season, Saquon Barkley had the Player of the Year, right? Where he, it's in your
reverse hurdle. Yeah.
Right. But Kevontae Turpin had probably the best punt return.
Yeah, that is
in
true.
The NFL at Washington. He did like a 360 and took off, man. And so, he's just been that dynamic of a playmaker. Really, that's why the Cowboys got him. They drafted him a few years ago, was that he definitely demonstrated that sort of explosiveness. So, yeah, I think that's the thing you want to see if they can get even more opportunities with him. But, yeah, with George Pickens there and CeeDee Lamb, the great CeeDee Lamb, obviously, hey, this guy could get his opportunities just because they're going to be paying attention to those other guys a lot too.
Hey, as long as CeeDee Lamb stays off the white, stays away from the referees, gets back, it's going to be cool. I just asked you that about Turpin because I think he's an electric player. Every year it seems like I see him taking snaps at running back, and I was thinking they got Williams there coming from Denver. They got Miles Sanders there. I was like, man, maybe Schottenheimer might give him the ball a couple times this season. But either way, I expect them to use him in gadget situations, jet sweeps, reverses, etc. And then obviously he is electric as a return man in the kick and punt return game as well. So I'm looking forward to seeing him. What is the Cowboys, in your opinion, their biggest factor to get over the hump, so to speak? They ain't been in the Super Bowl in a long time, and I think this season there's a lot of pressure on them. The Eagles just won the Super Bowl. The Commanders looked unbelievable last season. We'll see how they look this year. The Giants, I think, are going to be an Achilles heel for some teams, especially in that division. I don't think they're going to be good or anything, but I think they're just going to piss people off with their defensive line. What do the Cowboys got to do this season to get over the hump?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, besides signing Micah Parsons and getting that drama, you're situated, which, it could go a lot of different ways too. That's because, true. Notwithstanding Micah's trade request, he's on his 5th-year option, and it's a big jump from averaging $5.5–6 million to $24 million, which he would be paid if he plays under the 5th-year option. And then moving forward, hey, is this going to be a situation where if he does that, then we're talking about franchise tag next year? So this thing could go on a while, but sometimes you just never know because they can get to the end of the camp and strike some kind of deal. So that's the mystery of it. But point being, you need that guy if you're thinking that you really want to contend, which is what they tell us, right? You talk to Jerry, it's like, yes, I want to win the Super Bowl. I want to do it. I think the impact of George Pickens, what I mentioned on that offense, I think is going to be significant. If Dak Prescott can stay healthy, then that he could, get you to a certain place. I think the question, obviously, with Dak Prescott is going to be, if they do get back into the playoffs, it's like, how are you going to perform when you're in that situation again? And you can say that about a lot of teams, but that's definitely the narrative with the Cowboys. And because they've had good teams that have won 10, 12, 13 games, and, you get to January, in the middle of January, and that's that. Even Micah Parsons, we're talking about a guy who has the second most sacks in his first 4 years after Reggie White, which, if you can be mentioned in the same sentence.
Yeah, excellent edge rusher. Yes.
That's great. But in the playoffs, not much from him either. And so, Dak is the guy we're always going to look at in that, from that standpoint, just because the quarterback can do so much to lift the team. But they got to get there first. So, I'm maybe jumping way ahead of the deal here by saying you're talking about the playoffs for the team. But I think, again, if he can stay healthy, if they get Parsons back in the lineup, obviously, and then can keep Dak Prescott healthy, the Cowboys is kind of like every other year. They're good, they're bad, they're good, they're bad. So that being said, this might be when they're supposed to be good. But chasing Philadelphia, I think the Eagles showed everybody what you can do when you can dominate in the trenches. And those old Cowboys teams, and even the not so old Cowboys team, when they had Jason Garrett and they were 13-3 or whatever, they had, you go back to Zeke and when they first came in the league, they had a powerful offensive line. Anyway, I say all that to say you're not going to beat Philadelphia unless you're able to handle what they've got up front. Now, the Eagles lost a couple people on their defensive line, which the Kansas City Chiefs were probably applauding. But other teams that have to face the Eagles will as well, but they've replenished too. So we will see kind of how it all flows from that standpoint. But for the Cowboys, I think they'll be competitive, but, jury's still out, obviously. And to answer your question about the Super Bowl thing, I mean, it's been a long time coming. And I definitely, when I visited with Jerry Jones during training camp and tried to kick it around with him, boy, he can hem and haw and dance and all of that and tell you that, we've been a competitive team and we've been hanging around the rim is one of the analogies he likes to use. But, and if Dez had caught that, if they had ruled differently in that Dez catch, that might have been the year. And then how many Super Bowls has Buffalo won? I mean, he throws all this stuff out when the bottom line is your standard as the most valuable franchise in the NFL, which they are. I'm not just because of the marketing and the numbers. But when you talk about that and their popularity, their crazy fan base, you can love the Cowboys, you can hate them, and you can definitely, not feel they're obnoxious fans too.
Yeah, exactly.
All of that, the spotlight's there, and now you've got to kind of still get to that point where you're a serious contender. And, you think about the last 5 years, they hadn't been able to figure out the 49ers. It's like the 49ers have punked the Cowboys, in the postseason a couple times. And so, there are those teams that are still out there. I know the 49ers have a different set of circumstances they're dealing with, but let's say if they stay healthy and they're able to get back on track, then, they may be that factor in that, that team in the row for the Cowboys to have to deal with too. But anyway, it's a long way before we get to that point.
I think you said it best with the Cowboys. What are they doing with Michael Parsons? They got to figure that out. And Dak, it's up to Dak. I think it's up to really. Can he get over the hump in the playoffs? Because I think they're going to be contenders. I think Washington may take a step back as teams and defensive coordinators try and figure out and did Jaden Daniels. I think they will. No knock on Jaden, but it happens every year. We saw it with C.J. Stroud in Houston, who's electric too.
I think that's a great point, Bailey, because, the NFL gives us this stat, and they have for, age at least now, where they say, okay, there were 5 teams that made the playoffs that didn't make the playoffs last year, and 5 teams that, got into the playoffs that were not in the playoffs, and that sort of thing, which, speaks to the parity in the NFL, and it speaks to really the reason why the NFL is so successful, because everybody can buy in and see a path to being a contender. But all that said, what's the difference? And I was talking to Aaron Rodgers about this, earlier during the summer when we were talking. And, and I told him, I said, Aaron, I think, every year there's probably 4 or 5 teams in the NFL that you say are really good and they are going to be a contender. And you'll see how things flow in terms of injuries and how they're playing and, key players and who does this and that. And then there are 5 teams on the other end that are really, really bad. And you just know that there's no hope for them, right? And he looked at me and he said, you know what? I see what you're saying, but I think it's more like 10 teams that are good. And I think 10 or 12 teams that you could put in that spot and say can have a shot at it. And that was interesting coming from him. And then a couple of weeks later, or maybe it was a month later after we talked about that, he's in training camp, and he said he uses that same line of thinking as he was talking to the press about the Steelers' opportunities. And so he sees them as one of those teams, one of those 10 teams, maybe that if things go right, they can have a shot. And, I'm not going to quibble over if it's 5 teams that are good or 10. The point being, there's a lot of uncertainty at the top. And there's no certainty with about 5 teams at the bottom that are not going to have a chance.
No, absolutely.
And things have to happen, right? You got to stay healthy, one. You got to be playing your best football for two. If you play good early in the year, you can position yourself. But, I've seen teams, man, I remember one year the Cincinnati Bengals were like the last team in the NFL that was undefeated, right? They were like 5-0. And I don't even know if they made the playoffs that year, right? And so you've got to sustain it, and you've got to be playing your best football at the right time. But what you do early in the season still matters, because you can, avoid having to play catch up and build some momentum and learn things about yourself that you can fix as the season goes on. But that's what makes the NFL season so compelling.
Oh, absolutely. And my final question for you, Jarrett. It's been an absolute honor having you in my show. Getting your perspective has been great. Aaron Rodgers, you mentioned you talked to him this offseason. He's in Pittsburgh. Haven't heard a lot of noise out of Pittsburgh, which I think is great. I like that. I think Mike Tomlin's keeping things under wraps, and Mike Tomlin, I think, is among the best coaches in the NFL, among the best coaches ever. What are your expectations for the Steelers this season with Aaron at quarterback? I think they have a lot of potential.
Yeah, I think they do too. And, you look at where they were last year in December, they were like 10-3. And then the bottom collapsed. And that's kind of been part of the story, because we all know the story. Mike Tomlin has never had a losing season, which is great, right? But they haven't won a playoff game since like 2016, which is not.
That's
but
also true.
The point being that, their thing has been, we'll put good teams together and we will compete, and then let's see where we are. I actually talked to a couple of the players about that in training camp. Cam Hayward and TJ Watt was talking about it at his press conference, about how they really – just kind of have to do things to be, better prepared for that stretch run. And, injuries, any team and every team can talk about that and where you are. But there's also so much to be said for the momentum that you have. But the one thing that Cam Hayward said that was interesting about that, he told me, he said, I want to see this team have a little bit more consistency and a little, better complementary football from one unit to the next, so that we don't have to rely on the offense to score 30 points, and we don't have to rely on the defense to shut somebody down, every game. And so if we can do that, that's going to be a key barometer in seeing where we are as the season goes along, once we get to that point. But to your original part, Aaron Rodgers and Mike Tomlin, man, they both need each other. We know that. And so funny when you think that, the Steelers hadn't been to the Super Bowl, nor has Aaron Rodgers been to the Super Bowl since they were both in the Super Bowl together in like 2010.
Yeah, that's true.
And so both of these guys have to just be crazy trying to let me get back to this Super Bowl. And, Rodgers was like having a number 1 seed multiple times with the Packers, didn't work out. Tomlin's had these teams that have been winners, and then they fizzle at the end. So I think both of these guys recognize that. So I was in Pittsburgh the day that Aaron Rodgers signed, right? And Mike Tomlin had a cookout at his house, and he invited me to it. And it was the second year in a row that I went. It's like totally cool thing, laid back. And, a lot of his coaches there, a lot of his other people that, friends of the family, that sort of thing. But it's just a nice laid back thing. So I go, and Tomlin's like, my quarterback's coming over here. You can't do any interviews, right? This is off the record, right? Which is pretty much what you'd expect him to say. And so, I don't know, hour later, here comes Aaron Rodgers. And number one, just to witness those two embrace. And this was like just a few hours after Rodgers had signed his contract. And I think he, spent time at the Steelers headquarters with Arthur Smith doing stuff on the playbook and absorbing, all the football stuff to get started. But he came over to Tomlin's house, which was pretty cool. And in fact, the next day he went to Cam Hayward's house. Cam had a cookout for the players, and then Cam had a golf tournament like that Monday. So he had a really good ramp up to, and this was before his first minicamp, but just in terms of getting acclimated to his new situation. Well, anyway, so Rodgers comes in, he and Tomlin have this great embrace, and you can see that they have all this love and respect for each other.
Mhm.
And then he goes and grabs his food and comes sit right next to me, right?
Oh,
And so that's a natural conversation, okay?
yeah.
Because if there was somebody that he knew in there, I'm sure he knew some other people there, you know, the Steelers coaching staff, including Danny Smith, who's like, you know, their remarkable special teams coach. But he came and we just talked for a long time. And that was when I asked him about the whole thing, when I told him what I thought about, you know, teams, how many teams are good and that sort of thing. But it's a good conversation. And Tomlin's going, I told you this was all off the record and stuff. It's like, no, I'm not, I don't have a notebook out. We're just talking and stuff.
Yeah.
But one of the things that Rodgers told me that I didn't have to write down because I'm going to remember it was, you know, he talked about the relationship with Mike Tomlin that was forged and that was really cemented during those weeks when he was trying to figure out where he was, if he was going to play again, A, and B, some of the personal things he had in his life, including 2 or 3 people close to him dealing with cancer. And then if he's going to come back, where is he going to go or who's going to want him? All those things that he's sorting out. But he said that one of the constants was that he talked to Mike Tomlin, and it wasn't so much a hard sell from Tomlin. It was just kind of like getting to know each other and connecting on a human level. And he said that, you know, they talk, you know, at least once a week and sometimes more than once a week, and really got a familiarity with themselves, even though they had known each other just from being in, you know, NFL circles and that sort of thing. But that opportunity over those couple of months, while the rest of the world was like, what's Aaron Rodgers going to do? Why is he here? What's the deal? You know, and those were legitimate questions, really. But that was one of the reasons why Mike Tomlin was so cool during that whole process. It's like, oh, we'll deal with what we have to deal with, because he knew that it was likely that Aaron Rodgers was going to be joining the Steelers. But the relationship that they were able to develop through all of that as the season was going on and as the offseason was progressing, I think, you know, just really kind of laid the foundation for what happened. So now, that being said, Bailey, let's see what happens around week 8, week 9.
Yeah.
How everything flows. But, you know, you've got a veteran guy that if he could stay healthy, and that's always a, you know, question for anybody, what can he add to this offense? A whole lot of brain power, that's for sure. And his arm looked good from what I saw in training camp. And, you know, he's been in a million situations. And so the one thing that he also told me was that, you know, he doesn't feel like he has to come in and be the quote unquote, you know, leader that they have to build everything around. So I think it takes pressure off Aaron Rodgers to feel like he can come into a situation. You've got Mike Tomlin, who has this major presence anyway within the Steelers culture. So kind of flow with that. You've got other, you know, team leaders, and I mentioned Cam Hayward and TJ Watt and guys like that. Then you bring in a DK Metcalf. So they've got a lot to work with. So, you know, who knows how it's all going to turn out, but we'll definitely be watching.
Oh, yeah, and I am really excited to see the Steelers team. I think the additions of bringing in DK Metcalf, I think that was a huge move for Tomlin to do. And then to trade George Pickens also, Tomlin just straight up said, this is who I want, and I'm going to get rid of the so-called distraction in the locker room. It seemed like at times. Now he brings in Aaron, and it seems like under wrap. I've heard nothing. I've heard everything nothing but good things out of Pittsburgh, and then getting your perspective on their relationship in the offseason, that's really like, folks, that's a huge perspective on their relationship and what really went into Aaron signing there, because I think a lot of us were really just a lot of question marks around Pittsburgh. Like, I think everybody was like, you know, they're drafting Shedeur Sanders, they're this. I'm like, they might have Aaron Rodgers just in his back pocket. You know, Mike Tomlin might be just, you know, calling the shots here, and indeed, it certainly sounds like that. Wow.
Yeah, and they work, you know, Tomlin and Omar Khan, they work jointly, obviously, with Art Rooney II, the owner. And so that's one of the things that, you know, I've felt about the Steelers from observing kind of their dynamics over a number of years. And before Omar Khan, who's been with the organization for like 20 years, but, you know, he was an understudy to Kevin Colbert, who was the GM before. And so they've always struck me as having just this great synergy, because Tomlin is one of those coaches who during the pre-draft process will get out and visit a lot of schools. And I remember one time calling Omar Khan for an interview or something, and I said, okay, where? He says, I'm going to an airport, and I got Tomlin over here waiting for me. So they travel together, and they're joined at the hip when it comes to personnel issues. And I'm sure there are a lot of other teams that operate like that or want to operate like that, but I know that that's really the case with the Steelers. And so yeah, Tomlin will definitely take the lead, and Omar Khan will do his part and beat the bushes. And hey, I hadn't even mentioned Jalen Ramsey. That's another guy.
Dude, that's a huge
going to be a game changer for the Steelers. And I tell you what, Bailey, like I was there for a couple of days of practice the first week of camp, so they weren't hitting or anything, but you could still kind of see where they were trying to play fast in certain situations. I look and I see Jalen Ramsey out at left cornerback. Then I look up on the next play and I see him in the slot. And I see him on the next play. He's at the right cornerback, or he's trailing somebody or man to man. And so I think that's the thing that they feel so excited about in terms of adding him to their package on defense. And so, they think that they can take man. They're deep enough at cornerback, and we will see. They've got to prove this, but they think they're deep enough to be able to go man coverage against, Cincinnati for sure. I mean, that's target one, right?
Yeah.
Target two. But any of these teams in the NFL that have dynamic wide receiver packages. And I'll just finish on this, Bailey, just if you indulge me. George Pickens. Boy, what a delight to talk to him when I went to Cowboys camp. And I tried to talk to him and had brief exchanges during his time in Pittsburgh. It's a different guy. And so he definitely wanted out of Pittsburgh. And, with the one of the things he got excited about when we were talking was the route tree that he has with the Cowboys that he didn't have in Pittsburgh. He said in Pittsburgh, and this is what he said, and I'm just going to repeat what he said. I don't know if it to be 100%. I have no reason to doubt it. But he said that he ran comeback routes in practice with the Cowboys 3 times that day. I talked to him, and he said, my whole time in Pittsburgh, I never ran a comeback route. And I'm like, oh, my goodness, right? So he is so excited about how he can fit into their offense and how, his whole package as a wide receiver will be expanded. And, frankly, Arthur Smith, the Steelers offensive coordinator, now going into his second year, I mean, he's been challenged and he's been questioned and criticized about, his offense and whether or not it was, sophisticated enough, so on and so forth. And so adding Aaron Rodgers to that, if you think that Arthur Smith's offense is, not as deep as others, that's got to change with Aaron Rodgers, and it will change. I'm guessing, I'm expecting, but we'll see as the season goes on. But George Pickens, wanted out of Pittsburgh, so it may be a win-win thing, but he's got to be on his P's and Q's anyway because he's in a contract year, and if he wants to be extended with the Cowboys, it's going to require, being that guy and being a good influence in that locker room. But the one thing that I did see from spending some time in the Cowboys camp is that he and CeeDee Lamb really seem to have a genuine love for each other, right? Or respect for each other. And you'd see them together in between plays. They come to practice together. They seem to have really, started off on a good foot in terms of being wide receiver brothers, if you will. So we'll see.
Wow, man, Jarrett, your perspective and just unbelievable. It's an absolute honor getting to hear these stories and these perspectives about. I'm mind blown right now. Hearing that about George Pickens is really cool too. It's been an absolute honor having you on my show. I'd love to have you back on again. I hope you have a great Thursday. And man, we are finally here. I mean, we've been waiting all off season for football, and we are, really, really close for it to start. And I know you're looking forward to that too. But Jarrett, thank you so much for joining, my man. I appreciate it.
Okay, Betty, take care, man, and best wishes with your show continuing to grow, man.
Yes,
I love what you're doing. Okay.
Thank you so much, man. I appreciate that. Thank you for joining. Shout out to Jarrett Bell. USA Today reporter, been covering pro football since 1993. That is a special and absolute honor to have that perspective on this show. Folks, if you're watching, hit that like button because That was awesome. That was an unbelievable interview. Shout out to Jarrett for joining the show, getting that perspective on the Browns quarterback situation, the Cowboys. We're talking George Pickens, and also the Cowboys, Steelers, and Aaron Rodgers. Getting to hear Mike Tomlin, the relationship between the two this offseason. I think a lot of us were in the dark this offseason as to what the Steelers are doing at quarterback. I think we kind of had a gut feeling, but we didn't really know. So now you get some perspective there on that. That's a really cool perspective. Shout out to Jarrett for joining the show. That was an absolute honor. My man, Jarrett Bell, USA Today NFL columnist and reporter. Shout out to him for joining. Hit that like button, folks. Shout out to you guys for tuning in. A couple more things before I get out of here. This is some news out here in Knoxville here. Tennessee and Adidas have agreed to a $100 million partnership here. And I'm laughing because Tennessee fans are kind of torn about this from what I'm hearing. A lot of Tennessee fans don't like this here. Vol fans, how do you feel about this here? I'm out in Knoxville, and I'm getting all kinds of perspectives and people kind of talking to me about this here. Tennessee goes from Nike to Adidas to Nike, and now back to Adidas here. So interesting out of Knoxville here. Here's a look at their Nike uniforms they've been rocking the last few years. And then going back to the Adidas, the one thing I will say, Adidas did get the actual orange, right? I think Nike, I think classic Tennessee Volunteer fans can attest to this. I don't know if Nike had the right orange. I think Adidas had the right orange. And we may be going back to that. But Tennessee Volunteer fans, how do you feel about that? I'm getting a lot of torn reactions out of here in Knoxville and in the state of Tennessee. But sticking on Tennessee Volunteer news, Tennessee's trending towards naming Joey Aguilar as the starting quarterback. Joey Aguilar, they say UCLA transfer. He was there for like a month. He's actually an App State transfer, played for App State last season. And I'm good for Tennessee naming this kid a starter. I honestly wanted them to start the kid Merklinger, the kid behind him, but it seems like they're rolling with the transfer, rolling with the experience. Now, I don't think this kid is better than Nico Iamaleava at all. Tennessee fans might not agree with that, but I think Tennessee is kind of in trouble this season, losing a quarterback this late, and I don't think they're upgrading by any means. But I think the move seemed like it had to happen, but I think Tennessee may suffer the season because of it. I don't know. Volunteer fans, let me know how you feel about Aguilar becoming the starting quarterback. I really like the kid. They had a Merklinger behind a Merklinger, but it doesn't seem like they're rolling with him as Tennessee trends to start Aguilar. In other news, talking Notre Dame, we talked Notre Dame versus Miami yesterday. Mentioned the quarterback battle. Mentioned how C.J. Carr and Kenny Minchey are in a tight battle for Notre Dame's starting quarterback job. It seems as though Kenny Minchey has a slight edge over C.J. Carr. That's according to Pete Nakos over at On3 Sports. So that's something to watch as we get closer to the season here as Notre Dame heads down to Hard Rock Stadium in Miami, opening up against the Canes. That's something to watch. Speaking of the Canes here, and we'll finish off on this. Speaking of the Canes, Shannon Dawson believes he has another number 1 overall pick in Carson Beck. I don't know about that one. Canes fans, I don't know. How do you feel about Coach Dawson saying that? That is an interesting statement. He's certainly confident in Carson Beck. Canes fans, chat, let me know what you think about that. We're going to close on that. We're going to discuss all that here tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern with Alcorn State coach Leroy Frederick, who joins the show. We tried to have Coach Fred on Monday. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it, but Coach Fred returns tomorrow. Talk all things NFL news, college football news, and we're going to kind of break down how our Monday show here of college football review will look like for the season here, as Coach Fred will be a weekly guest here on Bailey Price Media Live on Mondays at 4 p.m. Eastern. We'll be doing our yearly, as we do every year on Bailey Price Media, we'll be doing our yearly college football review show. We'll do it every Monday here on Bailey Price Media Live, and I am very happy to have Coach Fred to join as a co-host for that. So stay tuned for that. We'll be live here tomorrow on Bailey Price Media Live. Shout out to Jarrett Bell, a columnist over at USA Today, been covering pro football since 1993. Shout out to him, veteran, for joining the show. Always love having that perspective. And we'll be back here tomorrow on Bailey Price Media Live. Pound the like button, subscribe, and become a member of the Bailey Price Media Army. Shout out to Eric for joining the BPM Army. Shout out to everybody in the chat for tuning in. It's been a great show here on this fine Thursday, and I'll see you tomorrow, folks. Peace.
it.